You're standing on a wind-cut ridge, staring at a city that should never have worked. There is no easy river beside it, no soft green valley, no obvious reason thousands of people should have built here, traded here, ruled here, or trusted this ground with their future. And yet the stones say they did. Again and again, archaeology keeps finding ancient cities in places that look wrong for city life, on high plateaus, inside brutal deserts, across salt flats, on exposed mountain edges, even in landscapes that seem built to drive people away. That's the paradox. Some of the most important urban centers in the ancient world rose exactly where common sense says they should have failed. In this video, you're going to walk through 10 of them, from forgotten capitals and desert strongholds to impossible settlements perched in places no planner would choose today. And with each one, the question gets sharper. Were these people adapting to hostile worlds better than we understand? Or are we still missing the real reason these cities were there at all? Machu Picchu. You're climbing a knife-edge ridge in the Andes, and the air is so thin, it feels like every breath has to be earned. Below you, clouds pour through the valleys like slow white rivers. Then the stone terraces appear, perfect steps cut into a mountainside that looks allergic to flat ground. Machu Picchu sits nearly 8,000 feet above sea level in Peru, built in the 1400s during the Inca Empire and brought to global attention in 1911 through Hiram Bingham's expedition. What it is, in plain terms, is a royal estate and ceremonial complex. Fine stone buildings, plazas, stairways, and agricultural terraces perched where most people would assume a city would starve, slide, or freeze. The hard specifics are what make it feel unreal. Hundreds of terraces stabilizing the slope, a drainage system designed to keep the mountain from turning into mud in heavy rain, and precision-cut masonry that fits without mortar. Water was captured from a spring and carried through canals and a chain of fountains, so the site didn't just have water. It distributed it like a managed utility. The impossibility isn't that the Incas built in stone. They did that everywhere. It's that they built something so complete in a place that punishes mistakes. One landslide, one blocked spring, one season of crop failure, and the whole plan should have collapsed. The mainstream explanation is that the location was strategic and sacred. High ground for security, a dramatic landscape for ritual meaning, and a controlled estate supported by surrounding communities that supplied food and labor. The counterpoint is the logistics. If it depended on outside support, how was that supply protected and organized on steep ridges and narrow trails, especially in bad weather? Why build a showpiece so far from the easiest farmland, unless the isolation itself was the point? Privacy, control, or a retreat that could be defended quickly. And when it was abandoned after the Spanish conquest era disrupted the Inca world, was that a planned withdrawal, a sudden crisis, or simply the moment the political network that fed this impossible city snapped? From this cold mountain air, we travel to a canyon where the city didn't climb the rock. Its builders carved the rock into the city. Petra. You're walking through a narrow sandstone corridor where the walls rise like curtains on either side of you, twisting so tightly the sky becomes a thin strip of light. Then the passage opens, and a facade, the color of fire, appears, carved straight into the cliff as if the stone itself decided to become architecture. Petra lies in what is now southern Jordan, and it flourished as the capital of the Nabatean kingdom, roughly from the late centuries BCE into the early centuries CE, before later earthquakes and changing trade patterns reshaped its fortunes. What it is: a trade city turned powerhouse, controlling routes that moved incense, spices, and other high-value goods between Arabia, the Levant, and the Mediterranean world. The hard specifics are in the survival trick. Petra's real miracle is water. In a region that looks like it should kill a large settlement, the Nabateans engineered channels cut into rock, ceramic pipes, plastered cisterns, and small dams to capture seasonal floods and springs, storing and distributing water through the city. The impossibility is scale versus climate. How do you keep a major urban center alive in a landscape that can go dry, then suddenly send flash floods roaring through the same narrow valleys? The mainstream explanation is that Petra worked because it mastered its environment. It didn't fight the desert, it harvested it, turning rare storms into stored water and turning a risky canyon into a defensible hub. The counterpoint is what the ruins can't fully answer. How many people lived there at peak times? And how close to the edge did the system run? Was Petra resilient or just one failed season away from collapse? If the city's wealth came from trade, what happened when routes shifted under Roman rule and changing economies? And if flash floods were a known threat, how often did the city get hit? And how quickly could its waterworks be repaired when rockfall or sediment choked the channels? Petra looks permanent in stone, but it survives on engineering that had to be maintained constantly. For centuries, it faded from the main travel routes and lived more as rumor than destination. Another reminder that a city can vanish without being destroyed. As we leave the red cliffs behind, the next wrong place won't be high or dry. It will be surrounded by water, built on top of a reef where cities have no business standing, and it still stands today. Nan Madol. You're crossing dark Pacific water toward a maze of black stone walls, and the first thing that feels wrong is the location. This is not a river valley, not a sheltered plain, not even a normal island town. Nan Madol sits off the coast of Pohnpei in Micronesia, built across small artificial islets on a coral reef with major construction usually dated between the 12th and 17th centuries. What it is, in plain language, is a ceremonial and political center made of basalt columns stacked into massive enclosures, canals, tomb platforms, and compounds that turn shallow tidal water into an urban landscape. The hard specifics are what make it sound almost fictional. More than 90 small islets linked by waterways, huge prismatic basalt logs, hauled and stacked in crisscross patterns, and a construction setting where every wall had to be built in a place that wanted to flood, shift, and corrode. The impossibility is not just moving stone without metal cranes, it is creating a durable elite center on top of a reef, where soil is poor, building surfaces are unstable, and daily life would depend on imported food, wood, and constant coordination. The mainstream explanation is that Nan Madol was the ritual capital of the Saudeleur dynasty, built to centralize power in a place physically separated from ordinary communities. In that reading, the watery setting was not a mistake. It was the point. Isolation created control, spectacle, and sacred distance. The counterpoint is logistics. If this center depended on supplies from the main island, how large could the resident population really have been before the whole system became too expensive to feed? How were the heaviest basalt pieces transported across open water and shallow reef in the quantities required, and over how many generations? Why build on a reef at all when more practical ground existed nearby, unless the site carried a ritual significance we still don't fully understand? And when Nan Madol declined, was it because its ruling system fell, because supply lines weakened, or because the environmental burden of maintaining such a place finally caught up with it? The canals still cut through the complex like black mirrors, but the city feels less like a settlement than a deliberate act of defiance against geography. From a reef city in the Pacific, we move to a place that solved the opposite problem. Not too much water, but almost none. Lalibela. You're climbing into the highlands of Ethiopia, and the landscape feels like a fortress made by weather. Then the ground opens into trenches, courtyards, and stone churches carved downward into the rock, as if the city was hidden first and built second. Lalibela rose as a major religious center in the Zagwe period, especially around the 12th and 13th centuries. And what it is both urban and sacred. A high-altitude settlement whose most famous monuments were excavated from living stone rather than assembled block by block. The hard specifics are startling enough on their own. Monolithic churches cut from volcanic tuff, connected by narrow passages and drainage channels, all created in a mountain environment where labor, food, and transport had to be managed far from easy lowland abundance. The impossibility is not just the carving. It is the sustained concentration of effort in a rugged setting where large-scale construction should have been slowed by terrain, climate, and access. The mainstream explanation is that Lalibela's elevation offered security, symbolism, and a sacred landscape suited to royal religious ambition. In that reading, the mountain setting gave the city protection and spiritual drama at the same time. The counterpoint is scale. How was the workforce fed and housed during long carving phases, especially when the monuments required not just brute labor, but planning, geometry, drainage control, and sequencing? Why choose to bury architecture into rock in such a demanding place unless concealment, permanence, or imitation of a holy landscape mattered more than convenience? And if Lalibela was meant to be both pilgrimage center and political statement, how far did its influence depend on ritual prestige rather than ordinary urban density? Standing there, you feel the same pattern returning. Cities in wrong places often make more sense once you stop thinking like a modern planner and start thinking like a ruler trying to control faith, movement, and survival all at once. But the next place takes that logic into a harsher landscape still, where survival depended on turning desert heat itself into part of the plan. And once you see that, the map starts looking less like common sense and more like strategy written in stone. Timbuktu. You're looking at a flat horizon where sand and sky blur into one pale line, and the wind keeps trying to erase your footprints as you walk. This is the edge of the Sahara, a place most people imagine as empty. Yet for centuries, Timbuktu was a name that meant wealth, books, and distance. Timbuktu lies near the Niger River in present-day Mali, and it rose to major importance from the 1300s onward, becoming a key hub in the Mali Empire and later the Songhai Empire. What it is, in practical terms, is a desert city that lived off connection. Caravans crossing the Sahara, boats moving along the Niger, and a market economy that linked gold, salt, textiles, and scholarship. The hard specifics are in the geography. Timbuktu is not built on a lush riverbank the way you might expect. It sits close enough to benefit from the river system, but far enough into the dry zone that sand constantly threatens the city. Its architecture adapted to that reality. Earthen construction, thick walls, and buildings that can be repaired and replastered again and again after wind and weather start eating at them. And the impossibility is the idea that a major intellectual and commercial center could thrive in a place that looks like it should be temporary. Yet Timbuktu supported mosques, schools, and manuscript culture on a scale that made it famous far beyond West Africa. The mainstream explanation is that Timbuktu was perfectly placed for the trade web. The Sahara was not a barrier, it was a highway, and the city sat at a node where desert caravans and river routes could exchange goods. In that view, the environment was not a mistake. It was a toll booth. The counterpoint is fragility. A node is only valuable while the network holds. When political stability breaks, when rival routes develop, when drought cycles hit, or when the river shifts, the city's advantage can flip into isolation. So how close did Timbuktu come to collapse during long dry periods or regional conflict? How much of its famous scholarly life depended on a narrow layer of patrons wealthy enough to sustain it? And when sand begins to swallow neighborhoods, how do you tell the difference between a city dying and a city simply moving its center of gravity a few streets over? Timbuktu shows that a wrong place can become the right place if movement keeps flowing through it. But the next city is wrong in a harsher way. It did not sit beside a network. It sat out in the desert itself and turned water and trade into stone. Palmyra. You're in the Syrian desert, the sun making the ground shimmer, and ahead of you a long colonnaded street stretches like a mirage made solid. Palmyra lies between the Mediterranean world and Mesopotamia, and it flourished, especially in the first 3 centuries CE, becoming a wealthy caravan city under Roman influence while preserving its own local identity. What it is a desert metropolis built on trade, acting as a bridge between empires that often did not trust each other. The hard specifics you can still read in the ruins. Monumental temples, a grand avenue lined with columns, an agora, civic buildings, and tomb towers rising beyond the city like markers of a class rich enough to build for eternity. The impossibility is scale versus environment. How does a city that large survive in a landscape that looks built to punish permanence? The answer is that Palmyra did not survive by ignoring the desert. It survived by managing it. Springs, wells, storage, and careful control of resources made habitation possible, while caravan wealth paid for everything the landscape could not provide easily. The mainstream explanation is that Palmyra was positioned brilliantly, on long-distance trade routes, taking a cut from goods moving between East and West, and converting that wealth into architecture, influence, and political leverage. In that reading, the city existed because geography made it profitable. The counterpoint is that profitable is not the same as stable. A trade city between great powers thrives only while it is allowed to thrive. When imperial priorities change, when war redirects routes, when security on the roads weakens, the same location that created wealth can become an exposed liability. So how often did Palmyra stand closer to failure than its ruins suggest? Did its impressive monuments rise during a relatively short golden moment that makes the city look more durable than it really was? How much of daily life depended on steady caravan movement, and what happened in lean years when fewer merchants arrived at the gates? And if control of water was so essential, how vulnerable was the city to drought, sabotage, or simple neglect? Palmyra forces the same thought as Timbuktu, but with sharper edges. Cities in impossible places often survive not because the land is kind, but because the political and commercial systems around them temporarily make the hardship worth it. Once that bargain breaks, stone begins turning back into silence. From here, we leave the old caravan world and head somewhere even stranger, a city raised in the middle of a lagoon, where the ground itself seems to argue against every foundation driven into it. You can already feel the pattern getting stranger. Some cities were built where life was hard. The next one was built where the land itself barely wanted to be land at all. Venice. You're gliding through a gray-green lagoon where the line between city and water keeps breaking apart. Wooden posts vanish beneath the surface. Stone facades rise straight out of channels. Boats slide past front doors, and the longer you look, the stranger the premise feels. This should be mud, marsh, and tides, not one of history's most famous urban centers. Venice emerged in the northern Adriatic over the early medieval centuries, growing from scattered lagoon communities into a major maritime republic by the late first millennium CE and beyond. What it is, in plain terms, is a city built on islands in a tidal wetland, tied together by bridges, quays, and an endless fight against water. The hard specifics are what make it feel impossible. Buildings had to stand on timber piles driven into soft sediment. Trade, food, construction, and daily movement all depended on controlling channels, docks, and shipping rather than roads. The lagoon offered protection from invasion, but it also meant saltwater corrosion, unstable ground, and constant maintenance. The mainstream explanation is that Venice succeeded because the wrong place solved a bigger problem. The marshy setting made large invading armies clumsy, while the sea opened routes for commerce, shipbuilding, and political influence. In other words, Venice accepted engineering pain in exchange for military security and commercial reach. The counterpoint is the bill that bargain created. How did a fragile settlement on mud transform into a city rich enough to cover itself in churches, palaces, warehouses, and arsenals without the environment swallowing the gains? How often did flood, subsidence, storm damage, or siltation bring the system close to failure before the records became famous enough to preserve the struggle? And if timber foundations were essential, how vast was the hidden forest economy needed to keep the city standing? How many trees disappeared inland so this watery capital could keep pretending it was solid? Venice feels permanent because stone survives in photographs, but its real history is one of relentless adjustment. Remove dredging, repair, political coordination, or maritime income, and the lagoon starts trying to reclaim the whole experiment. It's a city that worked because people never stopped fighting the place they chose, and if Venice turned water into advantage, the next city turned the edge of a cliff into shelter, storage, and long-term community. Mesa Verde. You're standing on the rim of a canyon in the American Southwest, looking across at stone rooms tucked into an alcove, like a settlement trying to disappear into the rock. Mesa Verde, in present-day Colorado, preserves the cliff dwellings of ancestral Pueblo peoples, built mainly in the 1100s and 1200s. What it is not one single city in the modern sense, but a concentrated landscape of communities placed in overhangs and on mesa tops, with multi-story stone and adobe structures, towers, storage rooms, and ceremonial spaces connected by ladders and narrow paths. The hard specifics make the setting feel wrong immediately. Water had to be collected and carried in a dry environment. Building materials had to be hauled across steep terrain. Fields often lay away from the cliff homes themselves, meaning food production and daily residence were not always in the same easy place. The mainstream explanation is adaptation under pressure. Alcoves offered shade, thermal stability, defensibility, and a way to organize communities in a landscape where rainfall was unreliable and tension may have been rising. In that reading, the cliff setting was not madness. It was strategy. The counterpoint is the cost of that strategy. How sustainable was it to keep families, supplies, fuel, and water moving through such awkward vertical space year after year? Were these cliff settlements a long-term preference or a response to changing danger and drought that pushed communities into harder but safer ground? And when Mesa Verde was largely abandoned in the late 13th century, what did that final generation think was happening? Did they believe they were retreating temporarily until rains returned? Or did they know the old pattern of life had broken for good? Archaeology can trace drought cycles, construction phases, and migration patterns, but it cannot fully restore the sound of those last departures. The baskets packed, the stored corn counted, the ladders lowered one final time. Mesa Verde proves that wrong places are often chosen not because they are comfortable, but because they solve a different problem better than the obvious sites do. And that idea carries us toward the final stretch of this list, where the locations stop feeling merely difficult and start feeling almost unreal. Because the next cities were not just built against geography, they were built as if geography itself had to be redefined. Sigiriya. You're walking across a flat plain in Sri Lanka, and then the landscape suddenly makes no sense. A sheer column of rock rises out of the greenery like the stump of a mountain sliced clean off from the world around it. At the top of that stone mass sat a palace complex with gardens, reservoirs, terraces, and defensive works arranged in a place that looks more like a challenge than a capital. Sigiriya took shape in the 5th century CE, most often associated with King Kashyapa, and what it is, in plain terms, is a royal and ceremonial center built on and around an isolated rock nearly 660 feet high. The hard specifics are what make the site feel almost theatrical. Symmetrical water gardens on the ground below, stairways climbing the rock face, mirror wall surfaces, frescoes painted high above the plain, and a summit zone where storage, residence, and command all had to function with almost no margin for error. The mainstream explanation is that Sigiriya's location solved the problem of fear. A ruler worried about rivals, invasion, and legitimacy would naturally favor a site that turned height into surveillance and stone into defense. In that reading, the rock was not an obstacle. It was insurance. The counterpoint is the cost of living inside that insurance policy. How much labor did it take to haul water, food, building materials, and luxury goods to a summit every single day? If the lower gardens and reservoirs were part of a carefully controlled landscape, how dependent was the whole system on constant maintenance by a large workforce hidden from the glorious final view? And if the site really was meant to project invincibility, why did it not remain the long-term center of power? Sigiriya feels like a place where psychology and geography fused together. A city built not where life was easy, but where power could be staged as unreachability. And if that sounds extreme, the final city on this list takes the opposite route. It didn't climb above the landscape. It flooded the landscape and made the water do the work. Tenochtitlan. You're in a valley ringed by mountains, standing at the edge of a lake, and before you stretches a city that seems to float. Causeways run across the water like stone spears. Canoes move between neighborhoods. Temples rise from an island center dense with markets, priests, soldiers, and noise. Tenochtitlan, founded in 1325 on an island in Lake Texcoco, became the capital of the Mexica, or Aztec Empire, and it may be the clearest example in history of a city that should not have existed where it did. What it is an engineered island metropolis. Canals, dikes, bridges, aqueducts, and chinampa agriculture transforming a lake environment into one of the largest urban centers on Earth at the time the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century. The hard specifics are staggering. Fresh water had to be separated from brackish water. Causeways had to connect the city to shore while still allowing movement by canoe. Food production had to expand through raised fields built in shallow lake zones. The mainstream explanation is that the site's impossible location created unmatched advantages. Water protected the city, boats moved goods efficiently, and a carefully managed hydraulic landscape turned risk into productivity. In that reading, Tenochtitlan was not built in spite of the lake. It was built because the lake could be mastered. The counterpoint is that mastery is not permanence. How vulnerable was the whole system to disruption, especially if dikes failed, causeways were cut, or aqueducts were damaged during war? How much of Tenochtitlan's astonishing scale depended on tributary labor and imperial extraction from lands far beyond the lake itself? And if the city was so brilliantly adapted to water, does its destruction tell us more about Spanish military pressure, or about how fragile even the best-designed, impossible city becomes once its networks are broken from the outside? Tenochtitlan is number one because it forces the paradox into its sharpest form. The wrong place became the right place so completely that when conquerors wanted to defeat it, they had to dismantle the environment that made it possible. Now step back and look at the pattern. Machu Picchu turned a mountain ridge into a controlled estate above the clouds. Petra made floodwater and desert stone serve a canyon capital. Nan Madol built political distance on top of a coral reef. Lalibela carved faith into highland rock. Timbuktu converted the edge of the Sahara into a marketplace of books and gold. Palmyra made caravan wealth bloom in the desert. Venice treated mud and tide as the foundation of a republic. Mesa Verde tucked whole communities into cliff alcoves where security mattered more than convenience. Sigiriya staged kingship on a stone tower in the middle of the plain. And Tenochtitlan transformed a lake into a machine for urban life on a scale that still feels unreal. The mainstream lesson is simple. These cities were not miracles. They worked because their builders understood trade, water, defense, labor, climate, and symbolism better than we often assume. But the counterpoint is what makes them unforgettable. In every case, the location still feels slightly wrong, as if we are seeing only the surviving skeleton of a decision whose full logic has been lost. We can measure walls, date wood, map canals, and trace trade routes. What we still can't fully recover is the moment someone first looked at a reef, a cliff, a marsh, a salt lake, a high ridge, or a desert canyon and said, "Build here." That may be the real mystery beneath all 10 cities. Not whether ancient people could survive in hostile places, they clearly could, but whether we still underestimate how often impossible was the point. Because sometimes the best place for a city is the place your enemy, your rival, or your future historian would never expect.